Welcome to Echo 361, Study Session 2, Central Banking. Introduction. In the previous study session, we discussed the evolution of money. In this study session, we will examine how central banking emerges, functions of central bank, and the responsibilities of the Central Bank of Nigeria. We will also discuss the relationship between government and central bank. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss how central banking emerges. 2. Highlight the functions of central bank. 3. Examine the duties and responsibilities of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Central Bank. A central bank is any entity that is responsible for the monetary policy of a country or a group of member states. The central bank can lend to other banks in times of need. The main objective of any central bank is to maintain stability of the national currency and monetary supply, but more active duties include controlling subsidized loan interest rates and acting as a lender of last resort to the banking sector during times of financial crisis. It should be noted that not all countries call the bank that performs the above roles central bank. In the United States of America, it is called the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Bank in India, and we also have European Reserve Bank. Emergence of central banking system. The development of central banking could be traced to the mid-19th century. According to Ajayi 2006, the central banks were known as the banks of issue during this period because their major function was the issuance of banknotes. However, as time went by, the right to perform this function was withdrawn from the banks of issue, and by the 20th century, this right was given to the central banks and the currency board. The name central bank came into use in the 1920s in order to reflect the status of the bank as the apex and the controller of the national monetary system. It was due to this change in name and the acceptance of the bank as the overseer and the controller of the monetary system that led to the development of what is now known as the principle of the central banking, which are given as follows. A. The central bank must be sole bank of issue. B. It has the duty of controlling the financial institutions indirectly through the use of open market operation and bank rate. 3. The central bank must be independent. 4. It should act as a banker's bank and government's bank. E. Some of its assets should be kept in liquid form so as to discount approved short-term commercial papers or government bills. And F. It must have adequate control over the commercial banks since they are principal creators of money. Prior to the 17th century in Europe, most money was commodity money, which is typically in gold and silver. However, promises to pay were widely circulated and accepted as a value at least 500 years earlier in both Europe and Asia. The medieval European Knights Templar ran probably the best known early prototype of a central banking system, as their promises to pay were widely regarded, and many regard their activities as having laid the basis of the modern banking system. At about the same time, Kublai Khan of the Mongols introduced fiat currency to China, which was imposed by force through the confiscation of specie. The oldest central bank in the world is the Riksbank Bank in Sweden, which was opened in 1668 with the help of Dutch businessmen. This was followed in 1694 by the Bank of England, created by Scottish businessman William Paterson in the city of London at the request of the English government to help pay for its war effort. Although central banks are generally associated with fiat money, under the international gold standard of the 19th and the earlier 20th centuries, central banks developed in most parts of Europe and Japan, though elsewhere free banking or currency burden were more used at this time. The problems with collapse of banks during downturns, however, led to wider support for central banks in those nations that did not as yet possess them, most notably Australia. Thus, with the collapse of the gold standard after World War II, central banks became more necessary and widespread. The U.S. Federal Reserve was created by the U.S. Congress through the passing of the Glass-Owen Bill signed by President Woodrow Wilson on the 23rd of December 1913. Whilst Australia established its first bank, whilst Australia established its first central bank in 1920, Colombia in 1923, Mexico and Chile in 1925, and Canada and New Zealand in the aftermath of the Great Depression of 1934. By 1935, the only significant independent nation that did not possess a central bank was Brazil, which developed a precursor thereto in 1945 and created its present central bank 20 years later. When Africans and Asian countries gained independence, all of them rapidly established central banks or monetary union. The People's Republic of China evolved its role as a central bank starting in about 1979 with the introduction of market reform in that country, and this accelerated in 1989 when the country took a generally capitalist approach to developing at least its export economy. By 2000, the People's Bank of China was in all senses a modern central bank and emerged as such partly in response to the European Central Bank, that is the most modern bank model, and was introduced with the euro to coordinate the European Central Banks, which continued to separately manage its respective economies other than currency exchange and base interest rate. Functions of central bank. The following are the traditional and modern functions of the central bank in any given country. 1. Implementing monetary policy. 2. Controlling the nation's entire money supply. 3. Acting as the government's banker and bankers' bank. 4. Managing the country's foreign exchange and gold reserves and the government's stock register. 5. Regulating and supervising the banking system. 6. Setting the official interest rate used to manage both inflation and the country's exchange rate, and ensuring that this rate takes effect through a variety of policy mechanisms. Traditionally, a central bank implements the country's chosen monetary policy. At the most basic level, this involves establishing what form of currency the country may have. When a country has its own national currency, this involves the issue of some form of standardized currency, which is essentially a form of promissory note. That is, a promise to exchange the note for money under certain circumstances. Historically, this was often a promise to exchange the money for precious metal in some fixed amount. Now, when many currencies are fiat, the promise to pay consists of nothing more than a promise to pay the same sum in the same currency. Many central banks are banks in the sense that they hold assets, that is, foreign exchange, gold, and other financial assets, and liabilities. A central bank's primary liabilities are the currency outstanding, and these liabilities are backed by the asset that the bank owns. Central banks generally earn money by issuing currency notes and selling them to the public for interest-bearing assets such as government bonds. Since currency usually pay no interest, the difference in interest generates income, called seigniorage. In most central banking systems, this income is remitted to the government. Typically, a central bank controls certain types of short-term interest rate. This influences the stock and bond market as well as mortgage and other interests. The European Central Bank, for example, announces its interest at the meeting of its governing council, or in the case of the Federal Reserve, the Board of Governors. In Nigeria, this decision is made by the Bankers Committee meeting. In some countries, the central bank, through their subsidiaries, controls and monitors the banking system. In some other countries, banking supervision is carried out by a government department such as the UK Treasury or an independent government agency. The central banks examine the bank's balance sheets and behavior and policies towards customers. Apart from refinancing, it also provides banks with services such as transfer of funds, banknotes, and other foreign currency. Thus, it is often described as a banker of banks. In Nigeria, the central bank keeps watchful eyes on the operations of the banks through the use of its monetary policy instrument. To influence the money supply, some central banks may require that some or all foreign exchange received be exchanged for local currency. The rate that is used to purchase local currency may be market-based or may be arbitrarily set by the bank. This tool is generally used in countries with non-convertible currencies or partially convertible currencies. The receipt of the local currency may be allowed to freely dispose of the fund required to hold the fund with the central bank for some period of time, or may be allowed to use the funds subject to certain restrictions. In other cases, the ability to hold or use the foreign exchange may be otherwise limited. In this method, money supply is increased by the central bank when it purchases the foreign currency by issuing the local currency. The central bank may subsequently reduce the money supply by various means, including selling bonds and foreign exchange intervention. Relationship between government and the central bank. The relationship between government and the central bank vary across countries, and this variability shows the way with which the central banks develop. Ajayi 1981 shows that the central banking in Britain started as a private institution. The increases in the responsibilities of the central banks have made some governments to take over their operations completely, or at times enacted legislation that regulated their activities. Nigerian government controls the central bank through subscriptions to the total capital of the bank. Ajayi 2006 put this relationship in three possible forms. First, the complete and total independence of the central bank. This enables the central bank to pursue monetary policies that it deems fit and appropriate at any particular time without the interference of the central bank. Second, this is a case where the central bank is another department or parastatal of government. In this case, the central bank derives its directives and control from the government, which is often through the Ministry of Finance. The bank could rarely initiate monetary policy without getting the approval from the government. The two cases above are the extremes, and neither of them is most effective in the implementation and execution of monetary policy. Complete independence of the central bank is not appropriate because monetary policy is part of the overall economic policy. Also, total control of the central bank is not advisable because it will not be different from other departments or agencies of the government that will be subjected to the civil service procedures and red tape. Thus, the bank will not be able to initiate and implement monetary policy effectively. However, the case that is preferred is one that is not tilted to either the extreme right or left. This could be a moderate case when the central bank is relatively independent within government and with the latter holding ultimate responsibility for economic policy. Put differently, this is a case where the central bank is completely responsible for the control and regulation of money and credit, as well as advising the government, but ultimately rejected to the overall government economic policy. Most central banks often operate within this third case. Central Bank of Nigeria. The Central Bank of Nigeria was established by the CBN Act of 1958 and commenced operations on the 1st of July 1959. The primary regulatory objective of the central bank, as stated in the CBN Act of 1958, is to issue legal tender, maintain the external reserves of the country, promote monetary stability and a sound financial environment, and to act as a banker of the last resort and financial advisor to the federal government. The central bank's role as lender of last resort and advisor to the federal government has sometimes pushed it into murky regulatory waters. In 1948, an inquiry under the leadership of G.D. Patton was established by the colonial administration to investigate banking practices in Nigeria. Prior to the initiative, the banking was largely uncontrolled. The G.D. Patton report, an offshoot of the inquiry, became the cornerstone of the first banking legislature in the country, the Banking Ordinance of 1952. The ordinance was designed to prevent non-verbal banks from mushrooming and to ensure orderly commercial banking. The Banking Ordinance triggered a rapid growth in the industry, with growth also came disappointment. By 1958, a few numbers of banks had failed. To curtail failure and to prepare for indigenous control, in 1958, a bill for the establishment of the Central Bank of Nigeria was presented to the House of Representatives in Nigeria. The act was fully implemented on 1st of July 1959, when the Central Bank of Nigeria came into full operation. In April 1960, the bank issued its first treasury bills. In May 1961, the bank launched the Lagos Bankers Clearing House, which provided licensed banks a framework in which to exchange and clear checks rapidly. By 1st of July 1961, the bank had completed issuing all denominations of new Nigerian notes and coins and redeemed all of the West African Currency Board's previous money. The Central Bank of Nigeria performs the following functions. 1. Issuance of currency as legal tender. With respect to the statute establishing the CBN, it is the only bank of issue in Nigeria. In pursuance of its function, the Central Bank withdrew the West African Currency Board notes and coins and issued the first national currency on the 1st of July 1959. In 1968, the CBN changed the notes and coins due to the Civil War, and by 1972 it introduced the current decimal currency to conform to most monetary standards all over the world. Number 2. Banker and advisor to the government. Virtually immediately after the establishment of the Central Bank of Nigeria, it took control of the banking business of the government. Also, the CBN provides banking services to state governments and other government-owned institutions. It can grant ways and means advances to governments of up to 25% of their estimated current revenue. According to Ajayi, the bank also owes treasury bills and treasury certificates up to 15% of estimated revenue of all governments of the Federation in the case of treasury bills, and up to 60% in the case of treasury certificates. The Central Bank of Nigeria could also lend to the government, and this is through long-term securities, which must not be more than 75% of the total demand liabilities of any one moment. Furthermore, CBN acts as the financial advisor to the government by making sure that there is some coordination between the government's monetary policy and the national economic objective of growth within the framework of monetary stability. It ensures that there is sound financial structure, which will ensure that commercial banks operate within the framework of the banking laws. Formulation of monetary policy. It is the CBN that is saddled with the responsibility of formulating and executing sound monetary policies through the use of discount rate, liquidity ratio, and or reserve requirement, moral suasion, and selective credit control. The bank also has the power to prescribe the proportion of demand liabilities that commercial banks must hold in the form of liquid assets. This will ensure that commercial banks are able to satisfy customers' cash requirements. 4. Formulation of exchange rate policy. It is only the CBN that is responsible for the formulation and execution of exchange rate policy in Nigeria. The CBN maintains the country's external reserve so as to protect the international value of the currency. Based on this, the bank is the custodian and manager of the country's gold and foreign exchange reserve. The CBN controls the foreign exchange earnings of the government and then use it to meet foreign exchange demands of all banks. Summary. In this study session, you learned that a central bank is any state. The main objective of any central bank is to maintain stability of the national currency and money supply. The development of the central banking could be traced to the mid-19th century. The central banks were known as the banks of issue during this period because their major function was the issuance of bank notes. The Central Bank of Nigeria was established by the CBN Act of 1958 and commenced operation on the 1st of July 1959. The primary regulatory objective of the central bank, as stated in the CBN Act of 1959, is to 1. Issue legal tender, maintain the external reserves of the country. 2. Promote monetary stability and a sound financial environment. And 3. To act as banker of the last resort and financial advisor to the federal government. This is the end of study session 2. Thanks for listening.